June 28th, 1709. A damp, smoke-filled field near the fortress of Poltava. This is not the clean, ordered environment of a European battlefield. It is a vision of hell. The air, thick and humid, is a repulsive cocktail of smells. The acrid bite of gunpowder, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the stench of sweat and fear rising from thousands of straining bodies, and the sweet, sickly odor of death already beginning its work under the oppressive summer sun. The sounds are a symphony of chaos, the deep, rhythmic roar of Russian artillery, a constant, earth-shaking thunder that feels less like a weapon and more like the wrath of God, is punctuated by the higher-pitched crackle of musket volleys. But above it all is the human noise, the guttural, triumphant roars of "Ura!" from the seemingly endless green-coated lines of Peter's infantry, and the weaker, desperate screams of the men in tattered blue and yellow, the legendary Karelians, the finest soldiers in the world, now being systematically butchered. On a crude litter, borne by frantic guards, lies a man whose face is a mask of pale, sweat-sheened agony. A Russian musket ball has shattered his foot, and the pain is a white-hot fire. But it is nothing, a mere distraction compared to the torment in his eyes. This is Charles XII, King of Sweden, the Lion of the North, the terror of Europe, and he is watching the death of everything he has ever built. He sees the Dalarna Regiment, his finest veterans, men who followed him through the blizzards of Narva and the plains of Poland, engulfed by a wave of Russian bayonets. He tries to shout an order, to rally a defense, but his voice is a dry rasp, lost in the infernal din. This is not a battle, it is an annihilation. And as he watches his invincible army dissolve into a panicked mob, he understands with chilling certainty that this is not merely the loss of a battle, it is the end of the Swedish Empire. The Stormaktstiden, the age of great power, is bleeding out into this Ukrainian mud, and with it, the legend of Carolus Rex. The balance of power in the north, held for a century by Swedish steel, is being irrevocably shattered, and a new, terrifying power is being born from the wreckage. How did it come to this? How did the most brilliant military commander of his generation, a man who had never known defeat, lead his army into this perfectly predictable, perfectly executed trap? To understand the broken man on the litter, we must first understand the demigod who led him here. This is the narrative of him, of Charles XII, the last Viking king, a man who became a legend in his own lifetime. He was the Lion of the North, the Alexander of his age, a soldier of such ferocious talent and ascetic dedication that kings and emperors trembled at the mention of his name. He took the throne as a boy of 15, and in a few short years, with an army a fraction of the size of his enemies, he redrew the map of Eastern Europe, humbling Denmark, conquering Poland, and shattering a Russian army 4 times the size of his own in a battle that seemed more a miracle than a military engagement. His name became a byword for victory, his army a symbol of invincibility. And yet, this is also the saga of a madman, a ruler who at the absolute peak of his power turned his back on a prostrate Europe and marched his glorious army into the one place from which no foreign conqueror had ever returned victorious. The endless frozen expanse of Russia. He knew the risks. He had been warned by his own generals, by history, by common sense itself. He saw the scorched earth. He felt the bite of a winter so cold, it froze birds in mid-flight. He watched his veteran soldiers die of starvation and frostbite. Yet he pressed on, deeper and deeper into the abyss, driven by a force that defied all rational calculation. Why? This is the central burning paradox of Charles XII. Why did the soldier king march on Russia knowing it was a death sentence, What dark compulsion, what fatal flaw in the heart of this military genius turned his greatest campaign into a suicide mission? Was it supreme arrogance, the hubris of a man who believed himself an instrument of God? Was it a strategic miscalculation of catastrophic proportions? Or was it something deeper, a psychological obsession, a rigid and unbending code of honor that made retreat and compromise utterly unthinkable, even in the face of certain annihilation? To solve this riddle, to understand how the lion became a lamb to the slaughter, we must return to the world that forged him, a world teetering on the edge of a new and brutal century, a cauldron of empires where the old rules of warfare were about to be consumed by fire and ice. To understand this man, we must first return to the world of his time, the turbulent dawn of the 18th century. It was an age of absolute monarchs and ceaseless warfare, a grand and bloody chessboard where the fates of millions were decided by the ambition of a handful of kings. In the West, the great powers were locked in a titanic struggle for global supremacy known as the War of the Spanish Succession. The France of the Sun King, Louis XIV, was bleeding itself white against a grand coalition led by England and the Holy Roman Empire. This colossal conflict consumed the attention and resources of Western Europe, creating a power vacuum in the East, a violent, chaotic space where new empires could be forged and old ones could die. And in this Eastern cauldron, the dominant power was the Swedish Empire. It was not a nation in the modern sense, but a military and commercial titan, a Baltic empire whose territories encircled that vital sea, controlling the lucrative trade in grain, timber, and iron. For 100 years, from the days of the great Gustavus Adolphus, Swedish armies had been the most feared in Europe, their discipline and tactical innovation setting the standard for all others. But this empire, for all its martial glory, was a colossus with feet of clay. It was vast, but sparsely populated, its power resting entirely on its ability to maintain military superiority against its larger, more populous neighbors. And those neighbors were stirring. To the south lay the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a sprawling, anarchic republic of nobles that was less a state and more a perpetual civil war, a tempting prize for any predator. Further south, the once mighty Ottoman Empire, the terror of Christendom, was in a slow decline, yet still a potent force capable of projecting power deep into Europe. But the greatest threat was rising in the east. It was the Tsardom of Muscovy, a realm of almost mythical size and backwardness, a slumbering giant that was now being violently shaken awake by a Tsar of terrifying and inhuman energy, Peter the Great. Peter saw his country as a medieval backwater and was determined to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. His goal was to seize a coastline on the Baltic, to build a navy, to open a window to Europe. And he knew that to do so, he would have to break the power of Sweden. This was the geopolitical powder keg into which Charles XIV was born, a world where Sweden's dominance was both absolute and profoundly fragile, a world where the slightest misstep could bring the entire imperial edifice crashing down. The character of Carolus Rex, the warrior king, was not born on the battlefield. It was meticulously forged in the cold, austere halls of Stockholm's Tre Kronor Castle. His was a lonely and demanding childhood, shaped by the immense shadow of his father, Charles XII. The elder Charles was not a glorious conqueror, but a stern, pragmatic administrator who had inherited a kingdom in chaos and restored it through ruthless efficiency. He had crushed the power of the aristocracy, establishing a form of absolute monarchy so total that the king was seen as accountable to no one but God himself. He drilled into his young son a rigid, almost fanatical Lutheran piety, a belief that the Swedish king was the chosen champion of the true faith, a divine instrument of justice in a fallen world. This was not the opulent, decadent absolutism of Versailles. It was a harsh, militaristic, and deeply religious ideology. Young Charles was raised not as a prince, but as a soldier in waiting. His games were drills, his lessons were in logistics and fortification, and his constant companion was the crushing weight of expectation. He was taught to endure hardship without complaint, to suppress all outward emotion, and to value duty and honor above all else, including his own life. The result was a young man of profound contradictions, intensely shy and taciturn in person, yet possessed of a terrifying, almost reckless bravery in the field. He developed an iron self-control, a disdain for comfort, luxury, and the company of women, channeling all his formidable energy into a single pursuit: the mastery of war. When his father died, leaving him the throne at the tender age of 15, the courts of Europe saw a boy they could easily manipulate, an opportunity to dismember the Swedish Empire. They could not have been more wrong. They didn't see a boy, they saw a title. They failed to understand that the Swedish system had not produced an heir, but a weapon. It had forged a mind that saw the world in black and white, a world of righteous duty and perfidious enemies, a world where negotiation was weakness and the only true diplomacy was conducted at the point of a sword. This rigid, dogmatic worldview, this belief in his divine mandate, would be the source of his greatest strengths and his most catastrophic failures. The year 1700. The predators, believing the Swedish lion was now a cub, decided to strike. A secret alliance was formed between three rulers who coveted Sweden's imperial possessions. Frederick IV of Denmark sought to reclaim lost territories in southern Sweden. Augustus the Strong, the ambitious Elector of Saxony and newly elected King of Poland, desired to seize the wealthy province of Livonia. And the most dangerous of them all, Tsar Peter of Russia, saw his chance to finally break through to the Baltic coast. They launched a coordinated three-pronged attack, confident that the boy king in Stockholm would be overwhelmed and forced to accept a humiliating peace. It was a perfectly rational plan, and it was their first great mistake, for they were not dealing with a rational opponent in the traditional sense. The response from the 15-year-old Charles was not one of fear or diplomacy, but of pure, cold fury. He saw this not as a political maneuver, but as a profound moral outrage, a treacherous assault by oath-breakers and liars. And his reaction was immediate and terrifyingly audacious. Leaving a token force to watch the Russians in the east, he gathered his army, commandeered every available ship, and did the unthinkable. He personally led a direct amphibious assault on the Danish capital's doorstep, landing at Humlebæk under the very guns of the Danish fleet. The move was so bold, so unexpected, that it completely paralyzed the Danish leadership. Within a matter of weeks, with Swedish troops threatening Copenhagen, Frederick IV was forced to sue for peace, signing the Treaty of Travendal and exiting the war before it had barely begun. This was the world's first glimpse of the real Charles XII. He was not a boy to be trifled with. He was a military prodigy, a commander who moved with lightning speed, who embraced extreme risk, and who led from the very front, inspiring his men with a courage that bordered on the insane. This first, stunning victory sent a shockwave across Europe, but it also did something more dangerous. It confirmed to Charles the righteousness of his path. He had faced his first test. With God's favor, had triumphed. It was a lesson he would never forget, one that reinforced his belief that audacity, speed, and an unbending will were the keys to victory, a formula that he would apply again and again, with ever more spectacular and, ultimately, tragic results. Beneath the veneer of the pious, duty-bound monarch lay the true engine of Charles's character, a secret, all-consuming inner demon. This demon was not a lust for power in the conventional sense. He had no interest in the vast accumulation of wealth, the grand palaces, or the sprawling harems that motivated other absolute rulers of his age. He did not seek to conquer new lands for the sake of imperial glory alone. His driving force was something far more personal and far more dangerous, a rigid, unforgiving, and almost pathological conception of honor and justice. When his three neighbors attacked him in 1700, he did not see it as a geopolitical chess move. He perceived it as a profound, personal betrayal, a violation of sacred treaties, and a stain upon his honor and the honor of Sweden. From that moment on, the war ceased to be a political conflict over territory and became, in his mind, a divine crusade to punish the wicked. He was not a king, he was a judge. He was not a general, he was an executioner. This explains his subsequent actions, which so baffled his contemporaries. After knocking Denmark out of the war, the logical move would have been to turn all his strength against the most serious threat, Peter's Russia. Instead, he turned south, into the chaotic morass of Poland, driven by a burning hatred for one man, Augustus the Strong. He despised Augustus not just as an enemy king, but as a morally corrupt, treacherous individual, an oath-breaker who had unjustly seized the Polish throne. Charles would spend the next 7 years of the war, 7 precious years, not in securing his empire, but in a relentless, obsessive, personal vendetta to hunt down and depose Augustus. He would drag his army across the vast plains of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, bankrupting his treasury and exhausting his soldiers, all for the sake of this single moral objective. This demon of unbending honor was his greatest strength on the battlefield, inspiring a fanatical loyalty in his troops. But it was his greatest weakness as a strategist. It rendered him incapable of compromise, deaf to diplomacy, and blind to the larger strategic picture. He could not make peace with an enemy he deemed morally unworthy, even if it was in his kingdom's best interest. He had to see them utterly broken and humiliated. This rigid personal code was a strategic prison from which he could never escape, a compulsion that would ultimately lead him away from the rational path of statecraft and onto the suicidal road to Poltava. The grand drama of the Great Northern War was ultimately a clash of 3 titanic personalities, a trinity of fates whose ambitions, flaws, and obsessions would shape the destiny of an entire continent. First, there was Charles himself, the ascetic warrior monk, the embodiment of a rigid, heroic, and divinely ordained past. He was a throwback, a figure who would have been more at home in a medieval epic than in the dawning age of cynical reason-of-state politics. His entire being was geared toward the purity of the battlefield, the test of will and courage, a sphere where his genius was unparalleled. He was predictable in his unpredictability, always choosing the most daring, most direct path, a strategy that repeatedly stunned his more cautious adversaries. But his inability to separate personal honor from state interest was a fatal flaw in an age of increasingly complex diplomacy. His first great antagonist, Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, was his perfect opposite. Where Charles was ascetic, Augustus was a hedonist of legendary proportions, a man renowned for his hundreds of illegitimate children and his decadent court. Where Charles was rigid and honorable, Augustus was a creature of pure political expediency, a treacherous opportunist who saw treaties as temporary conveniences and alliances as tools to be discarded. It was this moral flexibility, this perceived corruption, that so infuriated Charles and fueled his obsessive 7-year campaign to destroy him. But the third and most significant figure in this trinity was Peter the Great of Russia. Peter was something new, something terrifying. He was not a European monarch in the traditional mold. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of manic energy, a man who possessed the decadent vices of Augustus, but combined them with the iron will of Charles and a burning, all-consuming ambition to modernize his vast, semi-Asiatic empire. Unlike Charles, who sought to perfect a glorious past, Peter sought to build a brutal future. He was a supreme pragmatist. He understood his country's weaknesses and was willing to suffer devastating defeats, to sacrifice tens of thousands of his own subjects, as long as he could learn from his mistakes. The collision of these three men was inevitable and cataclysmic. It was a clash of worldviews. Charles's rigid honor against Augustus's cynical opportunism and Peter's ruthless pragmatism. It was this fateful encounter, this triangle of ambition and hatred, that set the stage for the epic tragedy to come. After decisively dispatching Denmark, Charles turned his attention eastward, where Tsar Peter's massive army was laying siege to the strategic Swedish fortress of Narva in modern-day Estonia. What followed was an event so extraordinary it immediately passed into the realm of legend, a battle that would define Charles's reputation and fatally shape his perception of his Russian enemy for the next decade. It was late November in the year 1700, and the weather was atrocious. A Swedish relief force of around 10,000 men, led personally by the 18-year-old king, advanced through a landscape of frozen mud and swirling snow. Before them, dug into fortified siege lines, was a Russian army of at least 40,000. The odds were impossible, a 4-to-1 disadvantage. Any conventional commander would have retreated or waited for reinforcements. Charles, driven by his code of immediate and decisive action, ordered an attack. As the Swedes advanced, a freak blizzard descended upon the battlefield, a wall of white that blew directly into the faces of the Russian defenders, blinding them completely. For Charles, this was not a weather event. It was a sign of divine favor, a cloak provided by God himself. He ordered a general assault under the cover of the storm. 2 Swedish columns, bayonets fixed, smashed into the Russian lines. The effect was one of sheer terror and utter confusion. The Russian soldiers, many of them poorly trained serfs, couldn't see their attackers until they were already upon them. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. Regiments fired blindly into their own men. Foreign mercenary officers found their orders ignored by a terrified peasant soldiery who suspected them of treachery. The entire, vast Russian army disintegrated into a chaotic mob. Thousands were cut down as they fled, and thousands more drowned trying to cross the Narova River. In a matter of hours, the battle was over. A tiny Swedish force had utterly annihilated an army 4 times its size. The victory was so complete, so shockingly absolute, that it seemed to confirm Charles's most deeply held beliefs, that his cause was just, that God was on his side, and that the Russian army was nothing more than a primitive, cowardly rabble that could be scattered by a single, decisive blow. This was the miracle at Narva, and it was a catastrophe. It implanted in Charles's mind a fatal contempt for his enemy, blinding him to the fact that while he might have won the battle, the man he was fighting was about to change all the rules of the war. To understand Charles's fatal march, one must first understand the nature of the beast he was trying to slay. The Tsardom of Muscovy at the turn of the 18th century was not merely an enemy state, it was a different world, a civilization operating on a scale and by a set of rules that were utterly alien to the Swedish king. It was a realm of breathtaking, terrifying size. To march from the Polish border to Moscow was to cross a distance equivalent to traveling from Paris to Rome, but through a landscape with few roads, fewer cities, and a climate of savage extremes. This was general distance, an enemy that had defeated invaders long before they ever saw a Russian army. Compounding this was general winter, a force of nature so potent that it could break the will of the most disciplined armies, turning their blood to ice and their hopes to dust. Charles, a man of the North, believed he understood winter, but he did not understand the Russian winter, a phenomenon of a different magnitude altogether. But the most formidable aspect of this antagonist was its human element. Russia possessed a seemingly inexhaustible reservoir of manpower. Peter could lose an entire army, as he did at Narva, and within a few years raise another. He could sacrifice his soldiers with a callousness that horrified European observers, viewing them not as individual warriors, but as a raw, expendable resource in the brutal calculus of his state-building project. And at the head of this massive enterprise was Peter himself, a man as vast and contradictory as the nation he ruled. He was a tireless reformer, a shipbuilder, a dentist, a legislator, but also a paranoid tyrant who personally participated in the torture and execution of his own palace guard. After the humiliation of Narva, Peter did not despair. He learned. He sent his officers abroad to study Western military techniques. He melted down church bells to cast new cannons. He implemented a brutal system of conscription. He understood that he could not beat Charles in a single decisive battle. Instead, he would use Russia's greatest assets, its size and its climate. He would lure the Swedish king deep into his territory, trading space for time, stretching his supply lines, and allowing the vast, unforgiving landscape to do the work of attrition. While Charles saw Russia as a primitive giant he could slay with a single heroic sword thrust, Peter saw it as a colossal anaconda, ready to draw its enemy in, slowly constrict, and crush him to death. Herein lies the central and most catastrophic mistake of Charles's career, the decision that sealed the fate of his empire. After the stunning victory at Narva, the road to Moscow lay open. Peter was terrified, his army shattered, his state in disarray. A swift, decisive campaign against Russia at that moment, in 1701, might have ended the war on Sweden's terms. His most experienced advisors, like Field Marshal Carl Gustav Renskiold, urged him to do just that, to strike the main enemy, the existential threat, while he was weak. But Charles refused. He could not, or would not, see the strategic reality. His mind was not on the grand chessboard of geopolitics. It was fixed on a single, hated piece. He turned his army south, away from Russia, and marched into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His goal was not to defeat Russia, but to punish one man, Augustus the Strong. The king's personal sense of honor overrode all strategic logic. He saw Augustus as a faithless traitor who needed to be disciplined, and he was willing to put the entire war on hold to do it. For the next 7 years, the peerless Swedish war machine was squandered in a frustrating and politically fruitless campaign. It was a quagmire. The Commonwealth was not a centralized state that could be defeated in a single battle. It was a chaotic web of competing noble factions, a political swamp where victories meant nothing and alliances shifted like sand. Charles would win battle after battle, occupy Warsaw and Krakow, and even succeed in deposing Augustus and installing his own puppet king, Stanisław Leszczyński. But he could never pacify the country. It was a long, grinding, and ultimately pointless war of attrition that bled his army, drained his treasury, and, most critically, gave his true enemy, Peter the Great, the one thing he desperately needed: time. 7 years. It was an eternity. In those 7 years, Peter rebuilt his army from the ground up, equipping it with modern weapons and training it in Western tactics. He conquered the Swedish provinces of Ingria and Livonia, and in 1703, on captured Swedish land at the mouth of the Neva River, he began the construction of a new city, a forward capital, a fortress, and a naval base all in one: St. Petersburg. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Swedish Baltic. While Charles was chasing ghosts in the Polish forests, Peter was building the foundations of a new Russian empire on the ruins of the old Swedish one. The fatal mistake was not the march to Poltava. The march was merely the consequence. The fatal mistake was the Polish quagmire. While the Swedish king was mired in his personal crusade against Augustus the Strong, Tsar Peter was engaged in a project of audacious and brutal creation. He saw the chaos in Poland not as a distraction, but as a golden opportunity, a strategic smokescreen behind which he could achieve his life's great ambition. With the main Swedish army hundreds of miles away, the Swedish territories along the eastern Baltic, Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, were left dangerously exposed. Peter unleashed his rebuilt armies on these provinces, not in the heroic, pitched battles favored by Charles, but in a slow, grinding campaign of sieges and scorched earth. He captured the key fortresses of Neutoborg and Nyenskans. And then, on May 27, 1703, in the desolate marshlands at the mouth of the Neva River, he laid the foundation stone of the Peter and Paul Fortress. This was the birth of St. Petersburg. To the rest of the world, building a city in this remote, disease-ridden swamp was an act of madness. To Peter, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. It was his window to Europe, a naval base from which he could challenge Swedish supremacy in the Baltic, and a symbol of Russia's irreversible turn to the West. The construction was an epic of human suffering. Tens of thousands of conscripted serfs and Swedish prisoners of war died in the process, their bodies buried in the very foundations of the city. It was, as it was later said, a city built on bones. For Charles, languishing in Saxony after finally chasing Augustus from the Polish throne, the news of St. Petersburg was the ultimate insult. It was a physical manifestation of Peter's defiance, a fortress and city built on sacred Swedish soil. This act, more than any other, convinced Charles that no treaty, no negotiated settlement with Peter, was possible. The Tsar did not just want territory, he wanted to supplant Sweden as the great power of the North. This was an existential threat that could not be ignored. The years of delay were over. The Polish distraction was settled. Now, the final act of the drama had to be played out. Charles gathered his army, the finest and most experienced fighting force in Europe, and prepared to march east. The goal was no longer merely to punish Peter, but to utterly destroy his new capital, to crush his upstart army, and to march on Moscow itself to dictate a permanent peace that would erase the humiliation of the last 7 years. The St. Petersburg Gambit had raised the stakes from a regional conflict to a fight to the death between two empires and two kings. The summer of 1708. This was the high water mark of the Swedish Empire, the moment of greatest triumph just before the fall. Charles XII assembled the largest and most magnificent army of his career on the plains of Poland. It was a force of nearly 50,000 veteran soldiers, the legendary Karelians, hardened by years of constant warfare, fanatically devoted to their king, and universally regarded as the most formidable fighting machine of their time. The invasion of Russia began not as a desperate gamble, but as a triumphal procession. This was the meteor in its blazing arc. The army crossed the Vistula River with meticulous organization, a river of blue and yellow steel flowing east into the heart of the enemy's territory. Peter's new army, despite its reforms, was still terrified of meeting the Swedes in open battle. They retreated, adopting a scorched earth policy, destroying everything in their path to deny the invaders supplies. But Charles, in this phase of the campaign, was unstoppable. He constantly outmaneuvered the Russian forces, forcing them into engagements they sought to avoid. On the 4th of July, 1708, at the Battle of Poltava, Charles, leading a smaller vanguard force, achieved a stunning victory. He personally led his troops across a swampy river under heavy fire, smashing a Russian army that had every advantage of terrain and numbers. It was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance and personal courage, a battle that seemed to reaffirm the legend of Narva. It was his last great victory. To his men and to the observers across Europe, it seemed that nothing could stop him. He was a force of nature, a demigod of war, marching inexorably toward Moscow to deliver the final killing blow to the Russian bear. The path seemed clear, his destiny manifest. But war is not merely a matter of battlefield victories. It is a contest of logistics, of resources, and of endurance. And as the Swedish army marched deeper into the vast, empty Russian plain, leaving their supply bases further and further behind, they were marching away from the world of heroic battles they understood, and into a new kind of war, a war against the land itself, a war they could not possibly win. At the pinnacle of his power, camped in Russia after the triumph of Poltava, Charles XII was no longer just a king. He was a concept, a myth of his own making. The psychology of this moment is the key to understanding the tragedy that followed. He had come to believe in his own legend. Years of uninterrupted and often miraculous victories, from the landing at Humlebeck to the blizzard at Narva to the swamps of Poltava, had provided what he saw as irrefutable proof of his divine mission. He was not merely a skillful general, he was Fortuna's chosen son, an instrument of God's judgment on earth. This profound sense of destiny, this hubris, insulated him from the grim realities that were beginning to gather around his army. He saw the scorched earth not as a clever strategy, but as the cowardly tactic of a terrified enemy. He dismissed the warnings of his own generals about the lengthening supply lines and the approaching winter, believing that the sheer willpower of his Caroleans and his own heaven-sent luck could overcome any material obstacle. It was during this period that Tsar Peter, deeply shaken by the defeat at Poltava, sent a series of increasingly desperate peace feelers to the Swedish camp. He was willing to make significant concessions, to hand over most of his Baltic conquests, save for the vital new city of St. Petersburg. For any other ruler, this would have been a stunning victory, the achievement of all of Sweden's primary war aims. For Charles, it was an insult. He was not interested in a negotiated settlement. The time for talk was long past. His goal was not territorial gain. It was the total and unconditional surrender and humiliation of his enemy. He famously declared he would only negotiate with the Tsar in Moscow. He saw the war not through the lens of a strategist, weighing costs and benefits, but through the lens of an Old Testament prophet, tasked with punishing the wicked. This messianic conviction made him psychologically incapable of turning back or accepting a partial victory. To do so would be to admit that he was merely a man, subject to the same limitations as any other. He had to press on, to see the saga through to its preordained conclusion, because the myth of Carolus Rex, the invincible agent of destiny, allowed for no other ending. He was trapped in the prison of his own triumph. To comprehend the sheer scale of the drama, we must zoom in on Charles's great antagonist, the man who was both his polar opposite and his dark mirror, Peter the Great. He was a physical giant, nearly 7 feet tall, whose immense frame was racked by nervous tics and epileptic seizures, a man of terrifying volcanic energy. While Charles was a product of a refined and ancient military tradition, Peter was an autodidact, a whirlwind of insatiable curiosity. He had traveled to Europe in disguise, working as a common shipwright in the dockyards of Holland and England, determined to absorb the West's technological secrets. He was a bizarre mix of progressive visionary and medieval barbarian. He could personally design a state-of-the-art warship in the morning, then preside over a drunken, debauched mock conclave with his cronies in the afternoon, and end the day by personally supervising the torture of political prisoners in the dungeons of his Kremlin. His single, all-consuming obsession was the transformation of Russia. He saw his country's traditions, its church, its nobility, as obstacles to be smashed. He forced his courtiers to shave their sacred beards, reformed the alphabet, and established technical schools, all with the same brutal, impatient force he used to build his canals and conscript his armies. Unlike Charles, who was bound by a rigid code of honor, Peter was the ultimate pragmatist. He had no honor, only interests. He could be treacherous, cruel, and cowardly, fleeing the field at Narva in a panic. But he possessed a quality Charles utterly lacked: the ability to learn from failure. The humiliation of Narva became his greatest teacher. He realized he could not defeat the Swedes in their own game of tactical brilliance. So he changed the game. He would use Russia's immense, un-European strengths, its infinite space, its brutal climate, and its expendable population. He would retreat, burn his own villages, and force Charles deeper into a wasteland, all while patiently building a new army that could fight on his terms. This was the sworn enemy Charles faced, not a king, but a relentless, elemental force of change, a man willing to sacrifice a generation of his own people to realize his vision of empire. It was a clash between a perfect, polished sword and a shapeless, monstrous club, and the sword was about to break. It is a common mistake to see Charles XIV as merely a brilliant general, forgetting that he was also the absolute ruler of a remarkably sophisticated and efficient state. The Swedish Empire of the 17th and early 18th centuries was not a feudal backwater. It was, in many ways, one of the most administratively advanced nations in Europe. The source of its military power was the unique allotment system, Indelningsverket. This was not a system of feudal levies or unreliable mercenaries. Instead, groups of farms, roten, were assigned the collective duty of hiring, housing, and equipping a single professional soldier. This gave the Swedish crown a permanent, standing army of highly motivated and well-trained native troops, without the ruinous expense of maintaining them in state-funded barracks. When war came, these men were already part of a disciplined regimental structure, ready for immediate deployment. This system was the engine that produced the famously disciplined and pious Carolean soldiers. It was complemented by an equally efficient civil bureaucracy. Under the firm hand of Charles XIV, the state had been centralized, its finances put in order, and its administration streamlined. This meant that when Charles XIV began his long wars, he had behind him a state apparatus capable of funneling a remarkable proportion of the nation's total economic output directly into the war effort. For nearly 2 decades, this engine of war performed miracles, keeping Charles's armies supplied and paid even as they campaigned hundreds of miles from home. However, this system, for all its efficiency, had a critical vulnerability. It was designed around the absolute authority and presence of the king. When Charles left Sweden in 1700 to begin his campaigns, he never returned for 18 years. He governed his empire from a campaign tent in Poland, Saxony, or Russia. For a time, the machine ran on its own momentum. But as the years dragged on, as the casualties mounted, and the financial strain grew unbearable, the system began to break down. The allotment system could not replace the thousands of veterans lost to battle and disease, and the treasury was eventually bled dry. The state was a perfect instrument for a short, decisive war, but it was being slowly destroyed by the king's unending obsessive campaigns. The very efficiency of the Swedish state became a trap, allowing Charles to wage his wars for far longer than was prudent, slowly bleeding his kingdom white to fuel a conflict that had long since spiraled out of his control. To truly understand the king's fatal isolation from reality, we must look at his personal life, or rather, the stark absence of it. Charles XIII was a monarch of radical, almost unnerving asceticism. In an age of opulent courts, dynastic marriages, and royal mistresses, he stood completely apart. He showed no interest in women and never married, leaving his kingdom without a direct heir, a profound political risk he simply ignored. His sister, Ulrika Eleonora, and his grandmother, Hedvig Eleonora, were left to manage the government in Stockholm, but they were distant figures, their advice often unheeded. The complex web of family ties and dynastic politics that governed the rest of Europe meant nothing to him. His only bride, it was said, was the battlefield. His only children were his soldiers. He likewise disdained all forms of luxury. He dressed in the simple blue and yellow uniform of a common officer, ate the same plain rations as his men, and slept on a bed of straw in a campaign tent, even when luxurious quarters were available. He drank only water and never touched wine or spirits. This monkish devotion to the craft of war had a powerful effect on his army. His men adored him for sharing their hardships, for leading from the front, and for his almost supernatural bravery. They saw him as one of them, a soldier king who was the living embodiment of their own stoic, Lutheran values. But this extreme personal austerity came at a terrible price. It cut him off from the normal human relationships and political realities that might have tempered his worst impulses. He had no wife to counsel caution, no children to make him think of the future, no court to expose him to differing opinions. His only family was the echo chamber of his military camp, surrounded by officers who revered him and were reluctant to question his judgment. This self-imposed isolation reinforced his black and white view of the world, a world devoid of the shades of gray that defined diplomacy and statecraft. He lived in a pure, abstract realm of honor, duty, and war, a realm that grew increasingly detached from the suffering of his people and the long-term interests of his kingdom. His personal virtues as a soldier became his catastrophic vices as a king. The triumphant march of the Karelian army into the heart of Russia began to falter, not with a great battle, but with the slow, insidious onset of a far more powerful enemy. As the summer of 1708 turned to autumn, the first cracks appeared in the magnificent war machine. The Russian strategy of scorched earth was brutally effective. The Swedes marched through a deliberately created wasteland. Villages were burned, granaries emptied, and wells poisoned. Forage for the horses and food for the men became increasingly scarce. The army's pace slowed to a crawl as soldiers were forced to spend their days searching for meager supplies. Then came the second blow. A massive, desperately needed supply column, commanded by General Adam Ludwig Löwenhaupt and accompanied by 16,000 fresh troops, was supposed to rendezvous with the main army. But Löwenhaupt was delayed, and then, at the Battle of Lesnaya, his force was intercepted and smashed by a Russian army led by Peter himself. Löwenhaupt managed to escape with a few thousand men, but the entirety of the supplies, the food, the ammunition, the winter clothing, was lost. Peter would call Lesnaya the mother of the victory at Poltava. And then, as the now starving and undersupplied Swedish army stumbled on, General Winter launched his main offensive. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was not a normal Russian winter. It was the Great Frost, the coldest and most brutal winter of the entire 18th century. The temperature plummeted to depths previously unrecorded. Wine and ink froze solid in their containers. Men who fell behind were found frozen solid on the roads. Frostbite claimed thousands of victims, and diseases like typhus and dysentery, fueled by malnutrition, swept through the camp. The invincible Carolean army began to disintegrate. They died not in a blaze of glory, but in miserable, shivering huddles. Charles himself endured the same hardships as his men, but his willpower could not keep them warm. For the first time, the king's faith in his destiny was being tested not by human enemies, but by the implacable, impersonal cruelty of the Russian landscape. The meteor was cooling, its brilliant light beginning to flicker. Faced with a starving army, a catastrophic loss of supplies, and a winter of apocalyptic severity, any rational commander would have retreated to lick his wounds and rebuild. But for Charles XIV, retreat was a psychological and spiritual impossibility. To turn back would be to admit defeat, to concede that his will was not absolute, that his divine mission had been thwarted by mere weather and logistics. His mind, trapped in the logic of the saga he had written for himself, searched not for an escape route, but for a new, heroic path forward. He found it in a desperate message from the south. Even Mazeppa, the elderly hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks, had long been a vassal of the Tsar, but was secretly chafing under Peter's centralizing rule. He sent word to Charles, promising to switch his allegiance and deliver the support of 50,000 Cossack warriors, along with vast stockpiles of food and supplies from his capital at Bedtime. For the beleaguered king, this offer seemed like a miracle, a sign from God that his cause was not lost. It offered a way to continue the war, to bypass the wasteland before him, and to open a new front against Moscow from the south. And so he made the fateful act, the decision that sealed his doom. He abandoned the direct, though now impassable route to Moscow, and ordered his skeletal army to turn south on a grueling march toward Ukraine to rendezvous with Mazeppa. It was a colossal gamble, based entirely on the word of a man he had never met. It failed immediately and catastrophically. Peter, his intelligence network far superior to Charles's, learned of Mazeppa's treachery at once. A Russian force under the ruthless Alexander Menshikov descended on Baturin before the Swedes could arrive, capturing the fortress, seizing all the promised supplies, and slaughtering the entire population as a warning to other potential traitors. When Charles and his starving army finally arrived in Ukraine, they found not a powerful ally and full storehouses, but a terrified and wavering Mazeppa with only a few thousand followers and another landscape of scorched earth. The Ukrainian gamble had been a disastrous miscalculation. The king had led his army away from a dead end and straight into a trap. The climactic moment, the resolution of a decade of war, arrived on the 28th of June, 1709. The Swedish army, or what was left of it, had been besieging the small fortress of Poltava for weeks, hoping to draw the main Russian army into a decisive battle. Peter obliged them. On a vast plain outside the city, the two armies finally faced each other. It was a contest that was decided before the first shot was fired. The Swedish force was a ghost of its former self. Barely 20,000 men remained, many of them sick, and all of them exhausted and half-starved. Their gunpowder was running low, their cannons few. Most critically, their king, their spiritual center, would not be leading them. A few days earlier, while inspecting the siege lines, Charles had been struck in the foot by a stray Russian bullet, a wound so severe he could not mount a horse. He would have to direct the battle from a litter, a devastating blow to the morale of an army that relied on the electrifying presence of their monarch at the head of the charge. Across the field, the Russian army was a picture of terrifying power. Over 40,000, strong, well-fed, well-supplied, and brimming with a newfound confidence. They were entrenched in a series of well-constructed redoubts, supported by over 100 artillery pieces that dwarfed the pathetic 4 cannons of the Swedes. The Swedish plan, born of desperation, was to launch a furious surprise attack at dawn, to break through the Russian lines with sheer audacity before their superior numbers and firepower could be brought to bear. The attack began with the Karelians' customary bravery, but it soon descended into chaos. Some units became bogged down assaulting the redoubts. Others lost contact in the smoke and confusion. When the main Swedish line finally advanced on the Russian camp, they were met not by a disorganized enemy, but by a disciplined wall of infantry and a storm of cannon fire that tore horrific gaps in their ranks. The battle became a systematic, industrial slaughter. The legendary blue and yellow lines wavered, broke, and then fled. The defeat was absolute, the annihilation of an army and an idea. The myth of Karelian invincibility, forged in the blizzard of Narva, died forever in the summer heat of Poltava. The aftermath of Poltava was a collapse as swift and total as the victory had been decisive. The retreat of the Swedish army was a desperate, panicked flight. The wounded king was bundled into a carriage, and with a small guard of a few thousand men, including the now fugitive hetman Mazeppa, he fled south toward the border of the Ottoman Empire, the only nearby power not at war with Russia. The rest of the army, the bulk of the survivors of the battle, numbering around 15,000 men under the command of General Löwenhaupt, were not so fortunate. Harried by Russian cavalry, they were cornered 3 days later at the village of Perevalokna on the banks of the Dnieper River. Trapped, with no means of crossing the wide river and with no hope of rescue, Löwenhaupt had no choice but to surrender. In a single, humiliating act, the entire remaining Swedish field army ceased to exist. Thousands of the finest soldiers in Europe were marched off into a brutal Russian captivity from which few would ever return. This was a catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. Sweden had not just lost an army, it had lost the entire generation of veteran soldiers and officers that had formed the bedrock of its military power for decades. The news of the disaster spread like wildfire, and the anti-Swedish coalition, which Charles had so painfully dismantled, immediately reformed. Augustus the Strong returned to Poland, Denmark re-entered the war, and Russian armies swarmed over what was left of Sweden's Baltic possessions. Meanwhile, Charles himself became a king in exile. He successfully crossed the border into the Ottoman Empire and was granted refuge by Sultan Ahmed III. He set up a small Swedish court in exile in the town of Bender in modern-day Moldova. But he was no longer a conquering hero. He was a political pawn, a guest whose presence was both an honor and a profound diplomatic inconvenience for his Ottoman hosts. For 5 years, he remained there, a lion in a cage, desperately intriguing, trying to persuade the Sultan to declare war on Russia, to open a new front that might allow him to reverse the verdict of Poltava. The great conqueror had become a petitioner, his empire was collapsing, and his long, strange exile had just begun. The final years of Charles XII's life are a bizarre and tragic postscript to his epic saga. His exile in the Ottoman Empire descended into a kind of political theater of the absurd. While he endlessly schemed to provoke a new war between the Ottomans and Russia, his hosts grew increasingly weary of their volatile and expensive guest. Finally, in 1713, the Sultan ordered him to leave. Charles, in a final display of his unbending and now utterly irrational will, refused. This led to the surreal incident known as the Kalabalik, Turkish for tumult, at Bender. The king, with a retinue of about 40 loyal soldiers, barricaded himself in his house and fought a pitched battle against an entire Ottoman army of several thousand Janissaries and Tatars sent to evict him. For a full day, this tiny band of Swedes held off their attackers in a farcical, yet undeniably heroic, last stand. Charles, sword in hand, fought like a common soldier's until he was finally overwhelmed and captured. This bizarre episode cemented his reputation across Europe as both a heroic madman and a figure of ridicule. After a brief period of imprisonment, he was finally released. In 1714, disguised and accompanied by only one officer, he made a legendary 2,000-kilometer horseback ride across Europe in just 15 days, finally returning to Swedish soil at Stralsund after an absence of nearly 15 years. He returned not to a triumphant empire, but to a kingdom on the verge of collapse, surrounded by enemies and bled dry by 2 decades of constant warfare. Yet he remained unchanged. He immediately set about raising new armies, determined to continue the fight. In 1718, during an invasion of Norwegian territory held by Denmark, he was directing the siege of the fortress of Fredrikstad. On the night of November 30th, while inspecting the front-line trenches under enemy fire, a single projectile struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The soldier king had met a soldier's end. The exact circumstances remain a mystery to this day. Was it a random enemy shot, a piece of Danish-Norwegian lid? Or was it an assassination, a bullet from his own side, fired by nobles weary of a king whose endless wars had brought their nation to ruin? The question remains unanswered, a final, ambiguous chapter in the life of a man who was anything but. The legacy of Charles XII is a fierce battleground of conflicting interpretations, a reflection of the profound and contradictory impact he had on the nations he touched. In his native Sweden, he is a figure of immense and deeply ambivalent national pride. For many, he remains Hjältekonungen, the hero king, the last great symbol of Sweden's age of greatness. He is the embodiment of Swedish courage, resilience, and piety. Duktighet, the righteous warrior who defended his small nation against a world of predators. His portrait hangs in countless homes, a symbol of a lost, more glorious past. Yet for others, he is the stubborn tyrant who, through his personal obsession and strategic blindness, single-handedly destroyed the empire his ancestors had built. He is the king who bled the nation of its men and its wealth, sacrificing everything for the sake of his own inflexible honor, leaving behind a ruined, second-rate power. This internal Swedish debate is mirrored in the memories of his enemies. For Russia, Charles is the perfect antagonist. He is the arrogant, overconfident invader whose crushing defeat at Poltava is seen as the true birth moment of the Russian Empire. The victory over Charles legitimized Peter the Great's reforms and announced Russia's arrival as a major European power. To celebrate this victory is to celebrate the foundation of modern Russia. For Poland and Saxony, he is a more ambiguous figure, the foreign invader who brought years of chaos and destruction, yet also the man who broke the back of Saxon domination. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was crafted by a Frenchman, the great Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. His hugely popular biography, History of Charles XII, King of Sweden, published in 1731, transformed the historical king into a philosophical archetype. Voltaire's Charles is a quintessential tragic hero, a man of superhuman virtues, courage, loyalty, honor, who is ultimately destroyed by his one fatal flaw, an excess of those very virtues, a stubborn pride or hubris. This romanticized image of the stoic, doomed warrior king became the dominant one for centuries, shaping him as a figure not just of Swedish or Russian history, but of a universal human drama. We are now brought back to the core question, the central paradox that has haunted this entire saga. Why did a military genius march his army to its certain doom? The final comprehensive answer is that Charles XIV did not see it as a death sentence. He marched on Russia because, within the rigid confines of his own character and worldview, it was the only logical, honorable, and indeed possible course of action. He was a prisoner of his own personality, trapped by the very qualities that had initially made him so successful. The first bar of his prison was the miracle at Narva. That astonishing, blizzard-shrouded victory implanted a fatal idea in his mind, that the Russian army was a contemptible rabble, and that he was, quite literally, blessed by God. This bred a profound hubris, an underestimation of his enemy that bordered on delusion. The second bar was his rigid, unbending code of honor. He did not view the war as a political chess game of interests, but as a moral crusade to punish the perfidious Tsar Peter. This made a negotiated, pragmatic peace, even a victorious one, psychologically impossible for him. For Charles, justice required not a treaty, but the total subjugation and humiliation of his foe. He had to dictate terms in Moscow. The third bar was his fatal strategic diversion into Poland. Those 7 wasted years, squandered on a personal vendetta against Augustus the Strong, gave Peter the precious time to rebuild, rearm, and learn. When Charles finally turned east, he faced a completely different Russian army from the one he had shattered at Narva. Finally, there was his profound belief in his own destiny, his role as Fortuna's chosen. This made him blind to the overwhelming evidence of impending disaster, the scorched earth, the failed logistics, the apocalyptic winter. He saw these not as insurmountable obstacles, but as mere tests of his will, trials to be overcome on his preordained path to glory. He was not a madman in the clinical sense. He was a man whose formidable intellect and willpower were chained to a set of tragically flawed premises. The very source of his greatness, his audacious self-belief, his iron will, his refusal to compromise, became the engine of his destruction. He was a perfect warrior of a heroic age, broken by the brutal, impersonal mathematics of a new era of warfare, an era defined not by courage, but by cannons, climate, and countless corpses. The verdict of history on Charles XII is a chilling and timeless lesson on the profound danger of absolutism, not just as a system of government, but as a state of mind. His life stands as a monumental testament to the limits of human will. Charles was perhaps the ultimate embodiment of the great man theory of history, a belief that certain individuals, through the sheer force of their character and ambition, can bend the world to their will. For a time it seemed he could. He defeated coalitions, deposed kings, and redrew maps with the force of his personality. He truly believed that his courage, his piety, and his sense of righteous purpose were forces more powerful than any material obstacle. And he was wrong. He was ultimately crushed by forces that do not yield to human will. The vast, soul-crushing distances of the Russian steppe, the brutal, inhuman cold of a record-breaking winter, and the sheer demographic and industrial weight of a rising nation-state. His story is a grand, tragic clash between 2 ages. Charles was the last knight, a man who fought for honor and glory, who believed in the decisive, heroic battle as the ultimate arbiter of fate. Peter the Great, his nemesis, was the first modern manager of violence, a man who understood that war was becoming a thing of logistics, attrition, and national mobilization. Peter won not because he was a better general. He was not. But because he understood that the age of heroes was over, and the age of systems had begun. The saga of Charles XIV serves as a universal warning that conviction untempered by pragmatism leads to ruin, that honor without wisdom is a suicide pact, and that any leader who comes to believe in their own myth is already on the road to their own Poltava. The individual will, no matter how powerful, eventually breaks when dashed against the unyielding rocks of geography, climate, and the collective, bloody-minded resilience of an entire people. The final frame of this saga is not the thunder of Poltava or the pomp of a royal court. It is a quiet, cold, and profoundly lonely image. The night of November 30th, 1718. A muddy, frozen trench outside the Norwegian fortress of Fredrikstad. The air is still, punctuated only by the occasional crack of a musket or the distant thud of a cannon. A single figure, clad in a simple blue uniform, has recklessly raised his head above the parapet to gaze at the enemy lines. There is a faint whistle, a dull thud, and the man slumps down. The soldier king is dead. There is no grand speech, no final charge, only silence in the cold Scandinavian darkness. The Lion of the North, whose roar had once shaken a continent, has been silenced not by a great army in a climactic battle, but by a random, anonymous piece of lead in the dark. This is the ultimate irony of his story. The man who lived his life as a grand, heroic epic, who sought a final, glorious confrontation with his great rival, dies in a forgotten skirmish, in a sideshow campaign, perhaps even at the hands of his own exhausted countrymen. The flame of the Swedish Empire, which for a century had burned with such terrifying, brilliant intensity, a meteor that blazed across the northern sky, is extinguished in this single, squalid moment. What is left is the frozen shadow of a saga, the body of a king whose triumphs were as spectacular as his failure was complete, a chilling and eternal monument to the man who flew too close to the sun and was consumed not by its fire, but by the unforgiving ice of the world below.